The Ghosts Who Want the Girls, our true haunted isolated farm story, presented by Absolutely Haunted. It was the summer we left everything behind, familiar streets, friendly neighbors, and comfort, for a wind-warped farmhouse that sat like a rotting tooth in the middle of nowhere, the Adams family farm. Our family was large, my father, mother, 7 siblings, and I. We brought our little brown dog, Brownie, a scruffy terrier mix who was more family than pet. He trotted beside us as we unpacked, unaware of the dark whispers that hung around the property like cobwebs. I had heard the rumors, half-spoken tales of vanished tenants and strange noises in the night, but I buried them deep. We weren't the kind of family that believed in ghosts. Not really, not then, but the house, well, the house believed in us. But after living there, I can say this plainly, without exaggeration or flourish, the Adams farmhouse was haunted. Not just eerie or unsettling, haunted, and I saw things in that house. I felt things, whispers from empty rooms, dreams that didn't feel like dreams. My parents couldn't afford to be picky with 9 mouths to feed. The rent was cheap, suspiciously cheap, and the rumors were just that. But deep down, I think they knew. No one expected peace in that house. And peace was exactly what we never got. It started almost immediately. We had been inside the house for only a few hours, barely enough time to unpack a few boxes, when the knocking began. At first, it was subtle, just a few dull thuds against the outer walls of the old white clapboard house. We thought it might be a branch in the wind, until the noise grew sharper, deliberate. It sounded like someone was standing out in the yard, hurling stones against the siding with measured force. My father and older brothers searched the entire property, yard, barn, tree line, even beneath the porch, but found nothing. There was simply no earthly explanation for the activity. But the worst was still to come. To our growing dread, the sounds moved inside the house. The knocking, the tapping, the rhythmic pounding that had once come from the yard now echoed through the walls, down the stairwell, across the ceilings, always close, yet always just out of reach. We'd chase it, all of us, scrambling from room to room, flinging open closet doors, checking behind furniture, beneath beds. But we never found anything. Eventually, we gave up the chase. We knew there would be no answers. No source, only sound, and fear. The noises continued, unchecked and unrelenting, until the day we finally left that cursed place. And sometimes, when I think back on that house, quiet and crumbling in the middle of nowhere, I wonder if the knocking ever stopped at all, or if it still echoes there in the dark, waiting for someone else to listen. Even our dog, Brownie, knew something was wrong. He was no ordinary pet, he was our constant companion, our furry shadow. In all the years we'd had him, Brownie had been glued to us kids, joining in our every game, chasing sticks and laughter with the same joy we did. But at the Adams farm, something changed. He began to act strangely, and not just once, but constantly. Day or night, we'd catch him pacing the halls or standing stiff-legged in a corner, his eyes locked on something none of us could see. His growl, low, guttural, and unshakably focused, would rise from deep in his chest as he stared into empty space. Sometimes, he'd be in the middle of playing with us outside, tail wagging, tongue lolling, then suddenly stop. As if a switch had been flipped, he'd disengage completely, walk toward the house with slow, wary steps, and sit down in front of the back porch screen door. Then he'd stare, just stare, his body tense, hackles raised, every hair on edge, his growl vibrating through the silence. We'd look, too, desperate to see whatever it was that had seized his attention, but there was never anything there. Just the empty doorway. It was late one night, long after the sun had vanished beyond the fields and the house had settled into its usual creaks and sighs. My mother, always the last to rest, was in the kitchen finishing the day's chores. Chores she saved until all 8 of us kids had been tucked into bed. She had just reached up into the cabinet, placing the final clean bowl in its place, when a sound drifted through the house that stopped her cold. Music, soft at first, like a memory being hummed back to life, then growing clearer, unmistakable. The piano, the old upright the previous tenants had left behind, gathering dust in the parlor. It was playing. Notes rolled out with haunting grace, a melody delicate and deliberate, performed with the kind of skill that only comes from years of practice. The music didn't stumble or hesitate, it soared. She stood frozen, her hand still resting on the cabinet door, listening as the song filled the darkened house. She knew that sound, she recognized the piece, though she couldn't name it. What chilled her wasn't just the music, but the fact that no one in our family could play the piano. Not like that. She moved carefully toward the parlor and peered inside. The bench was empty, the keys danced under invisible fingers, striking perfect notes without a soul in sight. Whoever or whatever was playing that piano was a master. She decided to try an experiment and rushed into the room as the song was in full swing. The minute she entered the room, the music ceased instantly. This, too, later became a common occurrence in our household. Someone was always having to disrupt Casper's musical endeavors, or they would continue for hours. My eldest brother, Melvin, was the only one of us old enough to be working. He held a job in town, and that small taste of independence set him apart, not just from his younger kids, but, it seemed, from whatever shared madness haunted the Adams farmhouse. The spirits had a particular fascination with him. Maybe it was his defiance, or the fact that he didn't scare easily. Either way, they delighted in tormenting him. Once winter came, his late shifts meant he wouldn't get off work until long after dark. The road that led to the farm was barely more than a dirt lane, narrow and forgotten, hemmed in by skeletal trees. It didn't just lead to the house, it ended there. Every night, Melvin had to drive that lonely path with nothing but his headlights cutting through the fog and frost, knowing what waited at the end wasn't just home, but something unseen that watched and sometimes followed. The farther we got into bad weather, the worse the road would become, with deepest winter being nearly impassable. This meant that the road would eventually turn to slush and mud, which made the only option to park your car quite a ways from the farmhouse, about half a mile to be exact. From there you would have to trudge the half-frozen road on foot. Because the house was pretty much isolated, anyone in the house could hear someone had parked down the road. We would hear my brother turn off his engine, and within moments, he would come running through the front door. When Melvin was questioned by our parents as to why he was running to the house, his answer shocked them. Melvin told us that every night, without fail, the moment he stepped out of his car and shut the door, the silence would close in. He'd start toward the house at a normal pace, boots crunching softly on the frostbitten dirt. But within just a few feet, he'd hear them, another set of footsteps, echoing his own, moving in perfect tandem just beyond the tree line that bordered the lane. If he slowed, they slowed. If he stopped, the woods held their breath with him. But if he ran, they chased. He never saw anyone, no shapes in the dark, no glowing eyes between the trees, just the sound, the presence, and the bone-deep certainty that something was out there, and coming for him. Most nights, by the time he reached the porch, he was breathless with panic, convinced that whatever stalked him was mere inches from catching hold. He said he felt it, and that feeling, the weight of unseen eyes, the electric hum of dread crawling up his spine, was worse than anything he could have imagined. And night after night, the footsteps came. My father had been raised in the country and had hunted most of his life. He had a vast well of knowledge about the animals that were local to our area and their habits and the sounds that they make, and the way that they behave. So when the sounds began to flow to the house from the surrounding woods, my dad was perplexed, trying to figure out what animal could be making those noises. Other things began to happen around the same time the sounds started, things more vivid, more personal, and far harder to explain away. It was during those bitter first months of winter when my brother Howard came home late one night after a date in town. The air outside had been sharp and still, and the house inside colder than usual. Howard quietly climbed the stairs to his bedroom, the old steps creaking beneath his weight. But as he reached the top, he stopped, frozen in place, breath caught in his throat. There, at the landing just ahead of him, hovered the specter of a man. He wasn't standing, he was floating, his feet suspended inches above the floorboards, his form pale and flickering like a film out of focus. Howard said the figure wore old clothes, unfamiliar in style but not in purpose, work clothes, maybe, from another century. But it was the eyes that held him. The man had no expression, no movement, just hollow, watching eyes, fixed directly on the little girls, his sisters, sleeping soundly in their bedroom with the door open. Howard didn't scream, he didn't run. Howard was so paralyzed with fear that he couldn't will his body to move. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to do something, but all he could do was stand there, heart pounding, staring at the thing standing on the landing. It seemed to be fascinated with his little sisters sleeping in their bed. Then, it was gone. No sound, no warning. Just gone. Howard bolted up the rest of the stairs, tore into his room, and leapt into bed, not his own, but his brother Lloyd's. Lloyd, jolted awake from what he later described as the best dream of my life, and he was less than thrilled to find Howard shoving him to the edge of the mattress, wild-eyed and trembling. "What's wrong with you?" Lloyd hissed, but Howard couldn't answer, not right away. Later. Howard tried to explain himself, to tell Lloyd why he had jumped into bed like a madman and shaken him from sleep. But Lloyd was much more annoyed than concerned, and wasn't having any of Howard's story. "Stop being creepy and go to sleep," he snapped, rolling over with a dramatic sigh. As far as he was concerned, it was just another one of Howard's pranks, and this one wasn't even funny. Howard always said he did exactly what his older brother ordered. He jumped into his bed, but sleep never came. He lay there in the dark, blankets pulled up tight over his head like a child, heart pounding in his ears. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind outside the window set his nerves on fire. And while the rest of the house slipped into uneasy dreams, Howard stayed wide awake, trembling beneath his covers until the sun finally rose. Now brother Lloyd was not having none of this talk about ghosts. He had not experienced anything in the house that he could not explain, and he was certain that the other siblings were just trying to pull his chain. Lloyd, thinking back on it the next day, had to admit he had heard the piano. But being the most skeptical among us, he brushed it off with a shrug and a practical excuse. "Probably mice," he muttered, "or some animal nesting inside the piano case." Never mind that what he'd heard wasn't random clinks or broken chords, it had been music. Actual music, flowing and complex. That part was harder to explain, nearly impossible. Still, Lloyd was determined to hold on to logic, to reason, to anything but the possibility that something unseen was at work in that house. But the spirit, it had plans for Lloyd, and it started with pranks. Small things at first, things that made him look careless, then things that made him look guilty, objects misplaced, tasks undone, and every time, it was Lloyd who took the blame. No matter how much he insisted he wasn't responsible, our parents weren't having it. The more he protested, the angrier they got, and that's when Lloyd stopped denying the haunting altogether. Because something in that house had chosen him, and it wasn't playing fair. Every night before turning in, my mother had a routine. She'd quietly slip into the room my sisters shared, check on them, pull the covers up if they'd kicked them off, then tiptoe back out. The two girls had an earlier bedtime than the rest of us, so usually they never even knew our mother had come in. But once winter arrived, that simple ritual turned into something much stranger. It started with the cold. Our mother would open their door and instantly be hit by a sharp, unnatural chill, and a howling wind. And every time, she would find the same thing. The window in the shared walk-in closet that connected their room to the ours had been thrown wide open. Snowflakes sometimes drifted in, the curtain danced like it was alive. Naturally, she blamed Lloyd. He was, after all, the family prankster. The one always cracking jokes or pulling stunts. To her, it made perfect sense. Lloyd was playing some twisted game, trying to scare us even more than we already were. She began confronting him, sternly, angrily, each time it happened. But no matter how much she scolded, or how earnestly Lloyd denied it, the window kept opening. Always at night, always before she arrived. My mother was so convinced Lloyd was responsible that after the third time she found the window wide open, she finally confronted him, right there at the breakfast table. The air was thick with the unspoken tension that had been building for days, and the moment her eyes locked on him, the atmosphere in the room shifted. "Lloyd, are you opening the closet window at night?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion, the words sharp like a blade. Lloyd's face went pale. He had expected this moment, yet still, the accusation stung. "What? No, Mom, I wouldn't do that. The girls could get sick. I may play pranks, but nothing that would hurt them." His voice trembled, but he held his ground, eyes wide and desperate for her to understand. My mother didn't respond right away. Instead, she fixed him with a cold, steely gaze, one that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Finally, she spoke, her words slow and deliberate. "If anyone is opening that window, and I catch them, their behind will pay the price." But her warning lacked conviction. She'd seen too much in that house, too many strange things she couldn't explain. She wasn't entirely sure it was him doing it at all. Her suspicion wavered, so she let it go, for now. But the unease didn't disappear. It only festered. A few nights later, my mother found the closet window wide open again. This time, though, Lloyd had been staying with a friend for the past couple of days. Her stomach twisted as the cold truth settled in. It wasn't him. She knew, with a sick certainty, that the window was opening by itself, some force beyond their understanding, beyond their control. The guilt surged within her as she realized how wrongly she'd accused him. When Lloyd returned the next morning, she wasted no time. She pulled him aside, eyes filled with regret, and apologized. Later, they went upstairs to check the window, but my dad was already there. He was hammering nails through the wooden frame, solid, precise, methodical. "What are you doing, Norm?" my mother asked, her voice shaking. My dad looked up. "No one's opening that window again," he said, his voice gruff, determined. "Not without everyone in this house hearing them. And if they try," he added darkly, "everyone in the house will hear the nails being pulled." That night, my mother entered the room, and what she found turned her blood cold. The chill in the air hit her like a slap. The winter wind howled through the room, biting at her skin. But that wasn't what made her heart stop. What made her stomach twist in horror was what she found next. The nails, the long, thick ones, over 5 inches long, that Dad had hammered through the window frame only days before. They were lying on the floor. She blinked in disbelief. Then, slowly, her eyes swept down to the floor, visually tracing each nail neatly arranged side by side beneath the window. They hadn't heard them being removed, no. There had been no sounds of creaking wood or scraping metal. The nails had simply popped out. The window was wide open once again, mocking her. Her heart raced in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the impossible scene. It was undeniable now. This was no longer just a series of strange occurrences. This was malicious. Something didn't want the children to be safe. The realization hit her like a freight train. The cold was no longer just an inconvenience. The winter winds, the freezing air pouring through that open window, it could kill them if this kept up. Sherry and Bev knew without a shadow of a doubt how the window was being opened. From the very first night in that house, they had been haunted, tortured by things they couldn't fully understand. They were grateful later when they were finally moved into the twins' room, away from those sinister spirits. They could breathe a little easier now, knowing the worst part of the haunting had come to an end for them, at least. But the horrors of that old room would never be forgotten, like the night the girls awoke. Their screams were caught in their throats as they realized they were surrounded. Standing, silent, and unnaturally still, their room was full of spirits who hovered inches above the floor, their eyes fixed on Sherry and Bev with a chilling, clinical intensity. Like a group of scientists studying insects trapped in a jar. Cold, unblinking eyes that bored into them. They could see their faces clearly. They were stark, pale with blank expressions that seemed to convey nothing but a cruel, terrifying curiosity. Sherry and Bev could feel their hearts pounding against their ribs. Both girls were frozen in their beds, unable to scream or move, their minds trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The coldness of the room seemed to intensify, pressing down on them, suffocating them. It was only when the ghosts faded into the shadows, vanishing without a sound, that the girls were able to breathe again. The ghosts wore clothes from all different eras, pale remnants of long-forgotten decades. Some looked like they'd stepped out of photographs from the early 1900s, others wore garments that might have belonged to farmers, soldiers, or even mourning widows from centuries ago. Their bodies shimmered slightly, translucent in the darkness, not fully there, and yet far too present. Sherry and Bev were never able to explain the fear they felt, not really. It wasn't just the sight of the dead that turned their blood cold, it was the way the ghosts watched them. Somehow, each time, despite the icy dread creeping through their bones, despite the ghosts looming around their beds like a morbid audience, they'd fall asleep. Not because they felt safe, not because they wanted to, but as if something pulled them down into sleep, heavy and dreamless, like the spirits had wrapped invisible hands around their minds and forced them into unconsciousness. More than once, they would wake to the sound of their parents' voices, tense whispers cutting through the cold. Discussions about the open window, about how it kept happening, no matter what measures were taken. The girls never spoke up, they never said what they'd seen, but deep down, they were sure of it. It was the ghosts, they were the ones opening the window. Over and over again, letting in the cold in so they would die. In time, Sherry and Bev had learned an interesting truth. Light made the spirits vanish. Whether it banished them or merely blinded the living from seeing them, they couldn't say. But it worked, and in a house where nothing else seemed to help, that fragile trick of illumination became their only defense. They pushed their twin beds together, forming a shared island of safety in the middle of the room. Above them, suspended from the ceiling, was the pull chain light, too high to reach from the bed. So they begged Melvin to tie a long piece of string to the cold metal chain, letting it dangle down between their pillows like a lifeline. Each night, they curled beneath the blankets, the string resting between their small hands, holding it like a talisman. And without fail, the dead always came. Silent, watching, surrounding them in the darkness with their hollow eyes and clothing from centuries past. But the moment the fear became unbearable, one of the girls would yank the string with trembling fingers, click. The light would flash on, buzzing faintly in the cold air. And the spirits would be gone. Sometimes it felt like they dissolved into the air, like fog burned away by sunlight. Other times it felt as though they were still there, just beyond the edge of vision, cloaked by the brightness. They never spoke of it, all they knew was that the light saved them, and they prayed it never went out. After the incident with the nails, the girls finally told their mom, Meredith, what was happening at night. Their story, accompanied by the window opening, is what convinced her that the girls were a target for this thing, and that to her it seemed as if it was trying to make them sick, perhaps enough to kill them, but why? She wondered. Without another moment's hesitation, my mother packed the girls' belongings and moved them into the newborn twin boys' room. It was closer to her and our dad's bedroom, and she needed to be near them. She had to keep a closer watch on them because now, she knew the house was no longer just haunted. She knew it was hunting. Moving the girls to a different room seemed to work as the girls no longer reported the ghostly people coming into their room to bother them, and the window in the bedroom they had departed stopped opening overnight. Meredith had begun to say it out loud, she wanted out. The fear was wearing her down. She got her wish after the next two incidents shook the very core of our family's resolve. It happened one ordinary evening, just after supper. The whole family had gathered in the living room, the air thick with the smell of leftover stew and the comforting crackle of the fireplace. In those days, most families didn't own a television set yet, and the radio was the heart of the home. We'd all crowded close, listening intently to one of our favorite programs, the flickering lamplight dancing over our faces. Then, it hit. A noise so thunderous, so violent, it was as if the entire house had been struck by lightning. The floor shuddered, everyone jumped to their feet, hearts slamming in their chests. Brownie let out a piercing yelp before bolting from the room with his tail tucked tight. Before the pounding of hearts had even settled from the first explosive noise, it came again, this time, louder, sharper, more destructive. A crash so deafening, it sounded as if every single pane of glass in the entire house had shattered all at once. The sound came from the dining room. Without hesitation, the entire family surged forward, feet pounding down the hall. The expectation was immediate and unanimous, the hutch. That towering oak cabinet, filled to bursting with plates, china, glass goblets, and serving bowls, must have tipped, fallen, exploded into a million glinting shards across the hardwood floor. What they found when they rushed into the room froze them in place. The hutch stood undisturbed, still neatly pressed against the wall. Not a single item was out of place. not a crack, not a sliver. The glass doors were intact. The shelves, steady. The dishes, untouched. The room was silent, unnaturally so, as if the sound had never existed at all. Everyone did notice that oddly enough the light fixture was swinging back and forth over the dinner table for no reason at all, as there was no breeze or any open windows, as it was winter and the house was closed up tight. Dad Norm had requested Lloyd and Melvin to give him a hand. They pulled the heavy cabinet away from the wall. The hutch had been left by the last tenants. It was an elegant piece, solid oak, with carved flourishes and glass-paneled doors, its craftsmanship far exceeding what one might expect in a rented farmhouse. Meredith had cleaned it, stocked it with her best dishes, and thought nothing more of it. Until now, after the impossible crash that left everything eerily untouched, something compelled them to move it. Perhaps it was instinct, but when they finally pushed the heavy cabinet aside, behind the hutch, oddly on the wall, was a small wooden door. It wasn't much taller than a child's playhouse entrance, and it was nearly hidden in the shadows. The paint around it had yellowed with age, and a rusted latch kept it tightly sealed. Meredith stepped back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Was that there before?" she said, voice trembling. "It was," Lloyd said quietly, kneeling. "We just couldn't see it." With a cautious glance at the others, Lloyd undid the latch. It popped free with a sound that was somehow too loud, as if the silence in the room recoiled at being broken. He reached forward and opened the tiny door. A black void yawned before them. No light penetrated the space beyond. It didn't even seem like a crawl space or storage nook. It looked like a tiny hallway. Lloyd leaned in slightly, trying to make sense of the strange little passage. "I think it goes deeper," he muttered. Behind him, Meredith whispered, "Close it. Right now." But Lloyd didn't move, because just as he leaned in further, they all heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of breathing. Not Lloyd's, not theirs, something else. Something in the passageway was breathing, slow and steady, waiting just beyond the veil of blackness. Marvin, pale but curious, handed Lloyd a heavy metal flashlight. Lloyd took it without a word. Behind him, the younger kids crowded close, jostling and craning their necks to get a look inside. They were half thrilled, half terrified. No one dared say it, but every one of them felt it. Whatever lay beyond that door wasn't meant to be found. Lloyd clicked on the flashlight. The narrow beam sliced into the darkness, illuminating a passage that none of them could have imagined. It was a hallway built for someone, or something, much smaller than any of them. The space was no more than 2 feet tall, maybe 20 inches wide. A child could have crawled through it, but no adults could. And stranger still, it kept going. The light hit no end. Just black, stretching on, absorbing the beam like it was trying to pull it in. "It goes way back," Lloyd whispered. "Farther than the house should allow." No one answered, because just then, the beam flickered. Once, twice, then it steadied, but what it showed sent a chill through every spine in the room. On the wall just a few feet inside were dozens of tiny handprints. Impossibly small. Behind Lloyd, Meredith gasped and reached for him. Shut it now." Lloyd hesitated only a second. Then he yanked the flashlight back, slammed the little door shut, and latched it with shaking hands. That night, not a single child in the house slept easily, and some never slept at all. My mom turned to my dad and informed him that she wanted out before something happens to one of her children. My dad agreed she was right, and they started looking the next day. We were packing up within 2 days. 3 days before we discovered the hidden door in the wall, something began to scream in the woods. It started low, just a distant wail, like the wind pushing through trees in a strange, uneven rhythm. But it wasn't the wind. We knew that right away. Wind didn't cry out like it was in pain. The first time we heard it, we were in the backyard, finally enjoying the first warm afternoon of spring. After being trapped in the haunted house for so long through winter, the sun felt like a gift, and we were eager to take it. But just as the game picked up, someone running, someone laughing, it cut through the air. A scream, high, broken, and inhuman. Long and hollow, like it came from somewhere too deep inside the woods. It didn't stop right away. It lingered, rising and falling, echoing like something calling out. We froze. The little ones went still mid-step. Even Brownie, our dog, dropped his ball and backed up toward the porch, his ears low, a growl forming deep in his chest. "Coyote?" someone asked in a whisper. But we'd heard coyotes before. This wasn't a coyote. It wasn't any animal we'd ever known. It was wrong. The screaming didn't come every night, but when it did, it was always near dusk. Some nights, it moved. One moment it was far off, the next it sounded like it was just past the fence line, close enough to see. But there was never anything there. We started avoiding the backyard after that, even in the daylight, because sometimes, if you stood still long enough near the edge of the brush, you could hear it breathing. My mom was feeding her chickens, and we kids were playing our usual games just a few feet from her. When the scream came out of the woods that backed the house, my mom dropped her bag of chicken feed and made a beeline right for us. She quickly began directing us to return to the house and go inside. She grabbed my sister's hands and quickly walked them towards the back door. My 2 older brothers dropped their football and gathered the younger boys around them and began herding them behind my mother. We were halfway to the house when the scream came again. this time, it was closer. It cut through the air like a blade, long, shrill, and full of pain. It sounded like a woman, and it stopped us in our tracks. For a moment, we tried to reason it away. Maybe a bobcat, someone mumbled. Big cats could make screams, or so we'd heard, but even that comfort didn't last. There hadn't been a confirmed sighting of one around here in over 20 years. They were said to be long gone, hunted out, driven off. And even if one had somehow returned, this sounded human. As it began to wail again, this time rising into a kind of sobbing moan, it became painfully, undeniably clear. It didn't just sound human, it was human. Whatever it wasn't just crying, it was grieving. Broken, terrified, trapped, and somehow, impossibly, it was coming from somewhere just beyond the yard. Maybe from the trees. We didn't run, we walked, fast and stiff, our eyes on the shadows shifting between the trees. I remember hearing her tell my dad later when he returned home that the sound had made her blood run cold and she was glad the move would begin tomorrow. Tonight would be the last night we stayed in the house, but we had no idea we would lose a family member the next day. That evening, just before the sun disappeared behind the hills, my brothers and dad grabbed their shotguns and headed into the woods. They were determined to find the source of the screaming we'd heard earlier. No one spoke much as they left, their faces tight with unease, the metallic click of the guns loud in the quiet. Brownie, our loyal little dog, had gone with them. He trotted ahead like he always did, tail up, ears perked, as if he could protect them from anything that might be out there. We watched from the porch until the woods swallowed them whole. The sun set, the evening turned to night, and they came back empty-handed. They hadn't found anything, no tracks, no signs of an animal, no broken branches. Whatever had screamed in the woods had vanished like smoke. But the worst part? Brownie didn't come back with them. We waited, and waited, sitting on the porch steps, calling out into the dark. We kept rattling his food bowl. But the night grew colder, the stars came out, and still, no Brownie. Our sisters cried themselves to sleep that night. The next day, while my family busied themselves moving the last of the furniture and boxes to our new house, we never stopped calling for Brownie. Each time we returned to the farm for another load, someone would go to the edge of the woods, cup their hands around their mouth, and shout his name into the trees. But no sounds from the trees ever answered. Dad could see how torn up my brothers were, and none of us could bear the thought of leaving him behind. Especially not here, especially not in that place. As they loaded the final haul into the old pickup, Dad turned to the older boys and said, "The little kids are safe with your mom at the new house. Let's go find our dog." There was no hesitation. My brothers grabbed flashlights and shotguns, and the three of them disappeared beneath the tree line, pushing farther into the woods than anyone had gone. They didn't talk much, just moved with purpose, eyes scanning the shadows. The deeper they went, the colder it seemed to get. Even in spring, the air felt wrong, damp and heavy, as if it had soaked up centuries of sorrow. They called Brownie's name over and over, but all they got was nothing in return. Once again carrying the shotguns for protection, they trudged deeper into the dark forest of trees. Around a mile behind the house, there is a creek that runs through the property. They found Brownie lying on a rock next to the creek. He was dead, and the way he died was horrifying. Years later, they told me, when I asked them how they had found Brownie. Dad said that Brownie had been torn in two and just left him there. There were no animal tooth marks on him, to be able to identify a predator. Dad said they never figured out what killed him. My brothers had brought his remains to the new house where we buried him, as no one would leave him at that place in the woods or in that unholy ground.